Okay. Well, welcome to week 4. I personally am glad to have gotten this far because we're getting to some of the punchlines now. I said, well, you need to give me a couple of weeks to get material out on the table. Now we can start actually building stuff out of what we've got. So I hope to present that first big punchline. So first of all, last week we outlined a minimal model of discursive practice. Minimal in the sense that I think any practice that deserves to be called discursive has to have these features. So I admitted this was involved a commitment to declarativism, to the idea that at the center of discursive practice is the iron triangle of discursiveness, declarative sentences on the syntactic side, assertion on the pragmatic side as the default significance of the freestanding utterance of those declarative sentences, and propositions as, on the semantic side, claimables, things that can be true or false, things that can be accepted or rejected. And the minimal model involves speech exclusively of assertion, and obviously there's all kinds of other things. Making a claim is understood as expressing a practical attitude of commitment to accept or reject. So we're looking at a kind of commitment that will deserve to be called doxastic commitment, the kind of commitment that belief, that corresponds with belief. But our license to call these doxastic commitments depends on their playing a role in reasoning. That is, the default significance of an assertion is to undertake a commitment whose entitlement is always in principle up for grabs. So although we're working in this model in what I call the default and challenge structure of entitlement, so unless somebody thinks anything funny is going on, you count as entitled to the commitments you undertake. But if somebody makes another assertion that stands to your assertion as a reason against it, as a challenge to it, then the entitlement goes into limbo, and to retain it, you need to respond with further assertions which stand as reasons for, and a conversation ensues. This practice of demanding and giving reasons for and against, I think is integral to the notion of an assertion or a claiming. It essentially involves these inferential involvements. So inferring and asserting are two sides of one coin. Built in the bilateral story that we need to be thinking about commitments to accept and commitments to reject, both reasons for and reasons against. And we looked originally to Greg Restall. Dave Ripley has developed his view as well, for a bilateral account of reason relations in terms of a normative pragmatics. So in their account, looking to answer the question in proof theory, when you say the premises gamma imply or have as a consequence the conclusion A, what are you saying exactly? In proof theory, you take statements like that one thing follows from another, as your basic mathematical objects, and you manipulate them. So you say, if this is a good implication, then what other implications do we know are good? Proof theory is studying the meta-inferential the meta-inferential structure of reasoning. And so a question arises, well, these basic consequence relations, your most basic objects, what do you mean by that? What is the notion of implication? And Restall's suggestion was that we think about the total position that you're in if you accept all the premises, are committed to accept all the premises in gamma, but you're committed to deny the conclusion alpha. And he says, if what we mean by saying gamma implies A, sorry, not alpha, gamma implies A is just that if you're committed to accept all the premises and committed to reject the conclusion, you are normatively out of bounds. And as I suggested, that we put it in a two-sorted deontic normative meta-vocabulary of commitments and entitlements, that was a constellation of commitments to which one could not be jointly entitled. And I pointed out that in this model, commitments have a sort of atomistic structure in that you can undertake a commitment to accept or reject just by asserting or denying some claim. That's up to you, maybe a stupid stance to take, but you can do it. You can do that one by one. It's true, it has consequences for what else you're committed to, may commit you to other things, and certainly may preclude you from entitlement to other things, but you can still undertake those commitments one by one. Whereas, because the notion of entitlement, the notion of incompatibility is understood in this setting as saying that A is incompatible with B if commitment to the one precludes entitlement to the other, in order to assess whether I'm entitled to the commitment that I've undertaken, you have to look to everything else, in principle, to everything else I'm committed to make sure that there isn't anything else I'm committed to accept or reject that precludes entitlement to this claim. So entitlement has an essentially holistic character. It's a position, it's a feature of, as Restall and Ripley put it, the whole position that you're in, the commitments and entitlements. Okay, so the claim was that here is a sketch of a normative pragmatics, a pragmatics in terms of commitments and entitlements. Moving to that dual deontics sorts, that is, having commitments and entitlements, is the result of noticing that the Restall-Ripley picture implicitly involves two flavors of norm, because the notion of a position really is the notion of a bunch of commitments, and that's already a normative notion. And then being in bounds or out of bounds, that whole constellation, that's a second normative status. And the suggestion was thinking about that in terms of commitment and entitlement. Not coincidentally, the concepts I use in making it explicit to elaborate discursive practice acknowledges these two flavors of deontic status that are implicit in the Restall-Ripley account. And the claim is that playing these roles is sufficient to entitle us to treat the commitments, entitlement to which is being changed by challenges and defenses, as specifically doxastic commitments, as opposed to practical commitments to do something next Tuesday, let's say. And what's special about the Restall-Ripley bilateralism is it gives us a way of defining reason relations in terms of the normative role that they play in this minimal discursive practice. Now, we spent considerable effort last time looking at the constraints on the normative significance of reason relations for discursive practice with the challenge that Macfarlane offers on that. And the claim was that this scheme satisfies his constraints. It gives us notions that are just the ones that he thought were still standing as candidates at the end of his criticism. So there's a picture of discursive practice implicitly normatively governed by reason relations that determine what's in bounds and out of bounds. And so where you're obliged in order to get back into bounds to do something, but it only constrains what you're obliged to do. It doesn't determine which thing you give up or what new thing you add. Okay, so the idea is that commitment to accept all the premises precludes entitlement to reject the conclusion. And the notion of incompatibility, we just say that commitment to accept all the premises precludes entitlement to accept the conclusion. That gives us a notion of incompatibility. And just at the end last time, we talked about Ryan Simonelli's argument for why incompatibility needs to be symmetric if it's to play its role in discursive practice. So from a systematic point of view, one of the things we got was our first glimpse of reason relations. I mean, I've talked about implication and incompatibility, but now we can say to be a relation of implication or incompatibility is to play this normative role in determining what's in bounds and out of bounds among constellations of commitments, which constellations of commitments to accept and reject you can be entitled to, and which you're precluded from joint entitlement to. Okay, that's our pragmatics. The task for today is to lay that alongside semantics, to think about what reason relations look like in a semantic metavocabulary. Because at a higher level, one of the things we're most interested in is what's the relation between what you can say in a pragmatic metavocabulary and what you can say in a semantic metavocabulary. And our overall suggestion has been, if you want to understand that, you have to do it at the right level, and the right level is the level of reason relations, of inclusion and exclusion in the normative sense that we've given to implication and incompatibility. Now, I motivated my approach to language from the beginning with opposition between two traditions in the philosophy of language, a logistical tradition and an anthropological tradition, lined those up with logical and semantic metavocabularies on the one hand, and focus on pragmatic metavocabularies on the other hand, pragmatic ones that are talking about what you're doing, the logical, but particularly the semantic ones talking about what you're saying. But we've really said very little about the semantic side of this, which, to be fair, is the one that is better worked out and entrenched in the tradition, so there's more presupposition that we understand it. Here's a quick, breathless sketch of the semantic tradition. Both proof theory and model theory were invented in the 30s. Proof theory by Gerhard Gentzen. It's the proof theoretic notion, let's take reason relations as primitive mathematical objects and look at relations among them. Sequent calculi, which let you derive one sequent from another. That was Gentzen. 2 weeks from now, when we look at more detail at the logic, that's going to be how we're going to approach the logic. He did that in the middle 30s. Tarski, at the same time, Tarski, who was a drop-in member of the Vienna Circle, and along with Albert Einstein, those were the days for the philosophers. But he was very much aware of Wittgenstein's claim in the Tractatus that what a true claim has in common with the fact that it pictures is in principle not something you can say. You can't picture that relationship. That's always in the background. You can only show it, you can't say it. Well, this gave a sort of mystical character to semantic claims. The members of the Vienna Circle were extremely suspicious of this. That's why Carnap starts off, let's do everything in terms of syntax, because we don't want to invoke properties that you can't talk about, where we know going in that we're talking nonsense and are just hoping to, get a warm and furry feeling about it. It's not clear what the output of it is on this account. And Tarski came up with a new way of thinking about it, a new way of thinking about the semantic relations in terms of models, a kind of truth conditional account, but where the truth conditions are specified in the form of sets of relational structures, sets of algebraic structures. And he showed how you could derive consequence relations from them, so that if you take one set of sentences and look at all the models that satisfy all of those sentences, then they entail any set of sentences that's made true by, all of those same models. So we can just look at set theoretic inclusion relations among the sets of models that make true the sets of sentences, and we can read off implication relations. And though he didn't focus on this, if the model sets that do this are disjoint, then you get incompatible. You get a reading of incompatible concepts. And for Carnap, this was transformative. He gave up the attempt to do everything in a syntactic metavocabulary that he'd done in his early masterwork, The Logical Syntax of Language, and embraced model theory on Tarskian grounds. Tarski had shown how you could use that to make truth talk respectable, but mostly you could do logic with it. You could see this as giving meaning to logical and non-logical expressions. So that was a great thing. The semantic metavocabulary was in principle expressively more powerful than the syntactic ones Carnap had used, and for multiple reasons, it looked as though the model theoretic metavocabularies were in principle expressively more powerful than proof theoretic metavocabularies were. Gödel's incompleteness theorems were taken to show this, but there were also cardinality concerns. Basically, since the 30s, people have explored the ways in which model theoretic semantic metavocabularies are expressively more powerful than proof theoretic ones. No longer, I would say, but and a good place to look for that outside of our particular project is the second half of Yarda Peregrine's book, Inferentialism, which is arguing that now proof theory has been developed to the point that it has the same expressive power as model theory. The next big thing that happens in model theoretic semantic metavocabularies is possible worlds, where following a pattern we'll see again, the first thing that's done with possible worlds is to explain logical expressions, particularly modal logical expressions. That's what the 14-year-old Saul Kripke did when he submitted his article to the Finnish journal Acta Philosophica Fennica, because nobody knows you're a dog at that sort of distance. They didn't know he was a 14-year-old kid. But we got a semantics in terms of possible worlds for modal vocabulary, which is what Carnap wanted more than anything in his 40s book, Meaning and Necessity. That's what he wanted to do with model theory. People using the possible world, so the first wave of the modal revolution in the 60s was giving us semantics for logical and particularly modal logical expressions. The second wave was extending that to a full-blown intentional semantics for non-logical expressions. And here Richard Montague was the driving force, showing how you could assign to predicates as their semantic interpretants functions that, given as an argument a possible world, gave you as the value of that function the extension of that predicate at that world. So that there's an intentional notion of property as functions from possible worlds to extensions to the set of things that they're true of. Not relevant to us here, but the third wave of the modal revolution, as I'm thinking about it, was Kripke's naming and necessity, connecting metaphysical issues with these formal semantic issues in a brand new way. But our concern really only goes as far as the intentional semantics in terms of possible worlds. I'm personally skeptical about whether the third wave was actually a good idea. But anyway, I think we didn't finish with the second one sufficiently. And I would mention, though, essentially everybody thought of the possible worlds framework as an enrichment of the model theoretic framework. It is an enrichment in that you're adding at least accessibility relations among models, but the thought was that the possible worlds model was also enriching the notion of a Tarskian model from the purely algebraic relational structure to something more concrete. After all, it was important to David Lewis that there are a whole lot of possible worlds that are so close to the actual world that we can't actually tell which one we're in. We don't know whether we're in one of the possible worlds where the mass of the universe is large enough that it'll eventually collapse or not. And that was enough to prove to him that possible worlds were not abstract relational structures, because he says, this isn't, and if I can't tell this actual world from the nearby ones, well, I can tell it from algebraic structures, he thinks. So this was part of the background of his self-described mad dog modal realism, taking possible worlds to be every bit as concrete as the actual world, just not causally accessible from the actual world. And as a cautionary tale, I'm not going to go into it. I'd mention John Etchemendy's fabulous book, The Concept of Logical Consequence, in which he makes a strong case that it was a mistake to run together possible worlds and Tarskian models in the way that you'll find done, for instance, in discussions of supervenience. You'll see Stolniker or Jae-Won Kim making arguments in terms of possible worlds based on theorems that they prove model theoretically. And Etchemendy thinks this is broken-backed. And anyway, he shows you have to be very careful about the relation between these frameworks. But I'm going to ignore that and say, look, second move in model theory was the possible worlds framework. And the third one is really Truthmaker theory, which is, it only really got codified in 2017. So, there's a lot we don't know about it. Kit Fine had been fiddling with it for a while beforehand, but it's really the two 2017 papers that I linked to in the webpage that defined what that approach is. I consider it the most sophisticated and expressively powerful representational sort of model theoretic semantic metavocabulary. So that's the one we're going to work with, the latest and the greatest, but mostly the most expressively powerful. And one of the ways that the possible world framework showed itself more expressively powerful than the Tarskian model theoretic framework was precisely that they could express intentional concepts, which the extensional Tarskian one could not. And the Truthmaker semantics is hyper-intentional. It can make distinctions that possible world semantics can't make. It can make distinctions among formulae that are classically interderivable. Equivalent classical formulae get assigned different meanings in Truthmaker semantics. It's a permanent embarrassment of, at any rate, classical possible worlds theories that all universally necessary claims express the same proposition according to it. If you represent the proposition by the set of worlds in which it holds, then 2 plus 2 says exactly the same thing as any other arithmetic truth. There are versions of possible world semantics that don't do that, but the standard ones do. But in Truthmaker semantics, you can make more distinctions. So it begins with a metaphysical picture, and this is really important to Kit. He, in some sense, cares more about the metaphysics of it than he does about the semantics of it. So you start with what he calls states. And the aim is to be as non-committal as you possibly can about states. But the guiding intuition is there things like Pittsburgh's being to the west of New York City or snow being white. Those are states that might or might not hold. They're smaller than possible worlds. The possible worlds are going to get built up out of states. So we're going to aim to be as flexible as possible about what these states are, but we require we impose two different sorts of structure on them. A mereological structure and a modal structure. And it's the combination of those that gives the Truthmaker semantics the expressive power that it has. So the mereological structure is that, as that term indicates, mereology is the study of parts and wholes, that some states are parts of other states. Or put slightly more formally, any two states can be fused to make a state that they're both parts of, to make a whole that they're both parts of. And the modal structure is that the states are divided into possible and impossible states. Now that's like possible worlds semantics, except in effect, possible world semantics only has one impossible state. It corresponds to the empty set of possible worlds, something that's true nowhere. Whereas Truthmaker semantics can allow that two states might both be impossible. Say that I don't know, all cats are made of glass on the one hand, and that 2 + 2 = 5 on the other hand. Those are both impossible states, but they're different impossible states. They are and then possible worlds can be recovered as maximal possible states, that is, possible states such that any other state is either part of them or the fusion of it with that state is an impossible state. So there's a notion of maximality that is natural for states given the modal structure, right? Mereologically, you can always put any two states together, any set of states together. But the question is, do you get a possible or an impossible one? The maximal possible states for any other state, it's either already part of it or so fusing it with that state just gives you back that state. Or if you fuse it with it, you get an impossible state. Those are just the possible worlds. So anything that we could do with the possible worlds, we can do in this setting. But as situation semantics in the 80s had already shown, there are real advantages to working with littler stuff than the whole possible worlds. You get the small stuff back by intersecting sets of possible worlds, but there's stuff you can't get that way. Okay, so far I don't think that's sort of hard to understand. He has to put various specific conditions on the mereological structure as it interacts with the modal structure, and this is part of where the power of the apparatus comes. So you can say, well, is it, are there some possible states that have impossible states as parts of them? And he rules that out. No, he's going to require that if a state is possible, then all the parts of it are also possible. And if you think, you can see that there's other constraints you could put on them. In our version, we're going to reject all of them. At least we're not going to require any of that stuff. Find does, because otherwise he can't see how to keep formal control over what's going on. That's what we can add to him. Yeah, I think that's what we need. Anything anybody wants to ask at that point? I mean, this is a sketch, as I said, can be filled in, read the fine articles, but this is basically how it works. Okay, nothing about semantics so far. Just talking about how he's thinking about the world metaphysically. This is the structure that's there to be represented. But the claim is that the notion of a state is so elastic, you only require that you can make sense of these mereological and modal structures with respect to it, that he says, whatever you think is there to be talked about can't you wrestle it around into this form? So that's the metaphysical basis of it. Semantics, he says, will associate with a sentence, well, what do we do in possible world? In the possible world setting, for the interpretation of what's expressed by a declarative sentence, that's the set of possible worlds in which it's true. We could say it's the worlds that are truth makers for that sentence. But here, another innovation on Fine's part. He says, well, I agree you should still have the truth makers. First of all, the truth makers are now going to be states. And there are some sentences that have only impossible truth makers, but I'm still going to sort of talk about those and distinguish between ones that, though they only have impossible truth makers, have different sets of impossible truth makers. But there's a distinction. There's actually two kinds of truth makers of a claim. There's exact truth makers, and there's things that are just part of larger things that contain, larger states that contain exact truth makers. So he's going to restrict the semantic content of a sentence to its exact truth makers. And you can always get all of the holes that contain that are larger than that, that make it true but not exactly true. But second innovation, he says, there's also a set of false makers. States, in possible world semantics, you build in that the false maker, the set of false making possible worlds is just the converse of the set of truth makers. It's just the rest of them. All the ones that don't make it true are false makers. But he says we don't always want to do that. Maybe there's some states that are neither true nor false makers. If we're talking about exact truth makers and falsity makers, I should say, then there are going to be some that are not exact false makers in that they make it false, but I guess none of their subparts do. Truth makers that are not exact truth makers. We do want to put some conditions, so we're going to represent the meaning of a sentence with a pair of the states that are its exact truth makers and the states that are its exact false makers. And we don't figure that we can, we don't require that we can compute one of those from the other. You just have these sets. Now, we want to put some conditions on that. It ought to be that they're disjoint, that at least for non-paradoxical sentences, there aren't any states which are both exact truth makers and exact false makers of that. We want them to be disjoint. He actually uses a stronger condition than that, exclusivity. If you just make them disjoint, you're not getting the modal character that you want of sort of the way these rule each other out. And so he says the exclusion condition is that the fusion of any exact truth maker of a claim and an exact false maker of it must always be an impossible state. That actually allows that there could be states that could both be exact truth makers and exact false makers, but they have to be impossible states. Their fusion with themselves is an impossible an impossible state. Now you can imagine other conditions there. But that's the basic that gives him his basic semantic interpretance. Right? And there's already an interesting metaphysical consequence from that. Because he says, I'm going to call a proposition any pair of a set of states, any pair of two sets of states that could be the truth makers and false makers of a sentence. Now, if there's a countable infinity of states, there's going to be an uncountable number of sets of the states. So, unless the conditions we put on being a proposition are much stronger than exclusivity that I just mentioned, which in fact is the only one he puts on it, there are going to be uncountably many propositions, pairs of things that could be truth makers and false makers of a sentence. But that's more sentences than, anyway, ordinary languages have got. So he's saying, look, there are those things you could mean out there metaphysically. Propositions, a pair of sets of states and another set of states such that any fusions across them are impossible states. Basically, any pairs like that are propositions. And there's way more of them than any particular language can express, though any one of them can be expressed in some language is the thought. So he's already seeing language as somehow inadequate to its task, or anyway to the richness that the metaphysics gives us. But that's what's out there for us to try to express in metaphysical terms, given his semantics. So he's giving us a model of how our language relates to our metaphysics, and at any rate one that is both formally tractable and demonstrably, expressively more powerful than what we had before. Now, I emphasized that you don't really have a semantics until you've defined consequence in it. So, for instance, Tarski shows how to map quantificational languages onto topological languages, where the quantifiers get the universal quantifier corresponds to topological closure operators. Fabulous mathematical result. Is it a topological semantics for first-order logic? Or is it just a mathematical representation theorem that is giving us an isomorphism or homeomorphism between two structures? So, for instance, the stone representation theorem tells us how to go back and forth between Boolean algebras and power sets, the set of all the subsets of a set. But it's not a semantics for it. It just shows us how to map these two structures onto one another. So we can make inferences from features of the one structure to features of the other. That's just mathematical bread and butter, but there's nothing particularly semantic about it. What makes Tarski's mapping between topological closure operators and universal quantifiers a semantically significant move is that he shows how to define validity and define the goodness of an inference in those terms. That's the point at which it's a semantics. And I don't know, maybe this point has been brought home to us in thinking about the three-valued logics, the tri-logics that have been the subject of much study over the last 20 or 30 years, where we've seen that you can use exactly the same semantic interpretations of the connectives, but if you define consequence differently in the multi-valued setting, you get completely different logics from them. That's something we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. Fine says, of course we can define consequence here, and in order to recover classical logic, say, or other logics, that's what we need to do. But he says, we're aiming at expressive power here, and we've got alternatives. There are different things we can mean by consequence. He suggests two and exploits those. One of them he calls entailment, and that's just carrying over into his setting the definition from possible worlds. So in the possible world setting, A entails B if every A world is a B world. If the set of B worlds contains the set of A worlds, so every A world is a B world. So in the sense of entailment, if every truthmaker of A is a truthmaker of B, then A entails B, he says. Second one, though, now that isn't using any of the fancy modal or mereological apparatus that he's got. It's just carrying over the definition from the possible world framework. So what one does, he said, well, we can invoke the mereological structure by getting a notion of consequence as containment, where we say A implies B if every truthmaker of A is contained in a truthmaker of B, and every truthmaker of B contains a truthmaker of A. So that's one level more complicated than the definition by entailment. It's more complicated in that it folds in, it makes use of some of the mereological structure of the metaphysical universe that he's talking about. But with that, you can show how you can get some logics. Others are more difficult. Intuitionism is not easy in the setting, for instance. But you can do many things. And you can get a supraclassical logic in which various distribution principles, De Morgan principles, for instance, don't hold. So I forget whether it comes out in the most straightforward way that disjunction doesn't distribute over conjunction, or whether it's the other way around, but there's an asymmetry between those distribution principles that makes it hyper-intentional. And when you move on to look at giving a semantics for non-logical expressions, that same hyper-intentional fineness of grain is very helpful. Okay, that's a summary of the Truthmaker framework. And I think that's enough for us to be going on with. There's a big literature on this. This is our best tool these days in semantics. And it's lingua franca for metaphysicians as well. Yeah, John.
I'm trying to get my head around what an exact truthmaker is. So I'm wondering, is anything strictly larger than an exact truthmaker, no longer an exact truthmaker?
Yeah. So for instance, his intuitive sort of excuse for this is saying the fusion of the state that snow is white and grass is green is a truth maker of the sentence "snow is white," but it's not an exact truth maker. There's stuff in there that doesn't need to be in the state for it to be a truth maker. A smaller one, a part of it, would already do it. Yeah, I mean, that's the intuition.
Yeah. So if you have two exact truth makers, their fusion is no longer an exact truth maker.
That's true.
And I don't know, is that a little funny? Because you think we
Or
have
at
no more
least-
information than we need in the one. We know more information than we need in the two. Second, so we put them together, we get more information than we need.
At least you would think that you ought to make a systematic distinction between the cases like that, where and the cases where something that doesn't bear on it, or something that, you know, the other conjunct could be something that I don't know, in other circumstances is incompatible with the claim, but not here. You know, I don't know. So yeah, maybe so. And I mean, it's entirely possible that that's already been worried about in the literature. So I say this is a big literature, and I am by no means on top of all of it. In particular, Fine wants to use this to interpret notions of essence, particularly of grounding, the metaphysical notions that people find useful. He wants to reconstruct in these terms. And that's the sort of place where this kind of distinction will come up. And even though it's only been 7 years since it's been out there, as I say, there's a lot of variance. And for all I know, that intuition is spoken to. Yeah, Dax.
As a into that literature, and 100%, this is a big concern. Because the thought turns on whether, so if you have the truth makers for A and the truth makers for B, it all turns on what are the truth makers for A and B. Is there another truth maker which is separate from the truth makers for A and B, or is it the fusion of all the truth makers in A and B? And a lot of changes as you'd expect, and that's basically
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, if this stuff is all new to you, make a note, find out more about it at some point. As I say, it's an important tool. But here's what Hlobil noticed. He said, even that containment definition of consequence, it is different from the entailment notion in that it does appeal to the mereological structure, but it doesn't make anything of the modal structure. Is there some way of putting the modal structure in there as well? And now I want you to look at page 2 of the handout. What he saw was that you could reproduce the Restall-Ripley definition of consequence in the Truthmaker framework. So theirs was, I'll just look at the single succedent case here. Gamma implies A, just in case any position that includes accepting all of gamma and rejecting A is incoherent or out of bounds, normatively out of bounds. You can't be entitled to that constellation of commitments. That's the notion of implication. Well then, we can define consequence in the Truthmaker setting by analogy, not to to Fine's two projected definitions, suggested definitions, but modeled on this bilateral definition, which he had already appealed to under the heading of exclusivity. Right? What he said about the relation between the truth makers and the false makers was that any truth maker of all of, any of the truth maker, the fusion of any of the truth makers with any of the false makers had to be an impossible state. Well, the semantic consequence definition, we call this consequence by implication rather than consequence by entailment or by containment, is that gamma implies A just in case any fusion of a state that verifies all the members of gamma is an exact truth member of all of members of gamma, with a state that falsifies A is an impossible state. Now, in the pragmatic definition, the constellation of positions is normatively out of bounds. And we saw sort of what effect that has. That's settling what's a reason for and a reason against, and so what's a challenge and a defense in the practice of giving and asking for reasons. Now we're looking at an alethic modality, possibility or impossibility, and instead of commitments by speakers, we're looking at assignments of semantic values to sentences and saying, to say that gamma implies A is to say that any fusion of truth makers of all of gamma with a truth maker of, with a falsifier of A is impossible. That definition uses both the mereological and the modal structure of Fine's metaphysics. It's looking at fusions of states that verify and states that falsify, and what corresponds to inbounds or out of bounds is possibility or impossibility. And we can get a notion of incompatibility in just the same way, that A is incompatible with gamma if every fusion of a truth maker of all of gamma with a truth maker of A is an impossible state. That means that A is incompatible with gamma. Really, it means the set gamma together with A is incoherent, but that's just to say, yeah, A is incompatible with gamma, and it's a symmetric relation, as we've seen reasons to expect. So look, at the level of reason relations, Hlobil can construct an isomorphism between what you can express in the pragmatic metavocabulary of commitments, entitlements, commitments to accept, precluding entitlement to reject. We can set up a rigorous isomorphism between that and truth-making and false-making by states, and say there's a notion of consequence of gamma implying A in case any fusion of a truth maker of all of gamma with a false maker of A is an impossible state. We don't have, that's our notion of out-of-boundness now. It's a modal notion. And where Restall and Ripley were looking at positions that in effect fused your premises and your conclusions, it's looking at all of those. Most importantly, it's looking at both what's happening on the left of the sequent turnstile and what's happening on the right. But we can now say exactly how things need to be, such that it's the very same relations of implication and incompatibility that are semantically expressed in our metavocabulary in terms of assignments of truth makers and false makers to them, that it's exactly the same relations of consequence and incompatibility that can be characterized semantically in terms of fusions and truth making, that can operate normatively to govern the practices of people who are making claims that express commitments to accept and commitments to reject, and who have their challenges to and defenses of those assertions and denials normatively governed by reason relations. It can be the very same reason relations in those two cases. I mean, no doubt our practices aren't like that. We're getting things wrong with the reason relations, but we can say what it is, what it would be for the practices to exactly match the reason relations that really metaphysically hold in as specified in a truthmaker setting. If we then think about our notion of a claimable, a proposition, as being the role that something plays in a set of reason relations, in a constellation of reason relations, a set of implications and incompatibilities, then we can say what we mean for it to be the very same reason relations that are specified in the pragmatic metavocabulary of commitments and preclusions of entitlement, the very same ones that are specified in the semantic metavocabulary of truth-making states and their fusions and possibilities and impossibilities. Again, if you ask when you're doing pragmatics, what do you mean when you say that A is a consequence of gamma? And the pragmatic theorist, in her pragmatic metavocabulary, says, oh, well, what I mean is that any set of commitments that includes commitment to accept all of A and commitment to reject, commitment to accept all of gamma and commitment to reject A is one you can't be entitled to. You can't be entitled to all those commitments. That's what I mean by saying that A is a consequence of gamma. I'm giving you an explanation of it in terms of what people do, because we understand that implication as constraining what's a reason for accepting what's a reason against rejections, but we understand the role of those, the normative role those play, how people have to act in order thereby to be treating it, taking or treating it in practice that A follows from gamma. So there's an actual explanation in a normative deontic pragmatic metavocabulary of the meaning of gamma implies A. And we can give an explanation in metaphysical terms, in alethic modal terms, in a semantic metavocabulary, and say, oh, well, what I mean by saying gamma implies A is that any fusion of a truth maker of all of gamma with a false maker of A is an impossible state. See, the metaphysics is going to explain the holding of this reason relation. So there's two different explanations. But the isomorphism shows that what they're explaining can be the same thing. It gives us our first, just as the pragmatic metavocabulary gave us our first glimpse of reason relations by explaining the normative role that relations of implication and incompatibility play in challenges to and defenses of claimings. So we can give, so we got our first sort of glimpse of reason relations, but this isomorphism between a sophisticated semantic metavocabulary and that normative pragmatic metavocabulary entitles us to talk about what they're both pointing at, the common structure, the one that can be explained metaphysically in a semantic metavocabulary and normatively, pragmatically in a pragmatic metavocabulary. Now we get our first binocular view of reason relations. I mean, later on, we're going to find two other kinds of metavocabularies which also let you specify, and we can prove can specify the same reason relations, but they don't explain it. The other two are logical metavocabularies, the sequent calculus metavocabulary for introducing logical vocabulary is a way of specifying reason relations, and the implication space semantics that's model theoretic but not representational, it has a way of specifying them, but they're just making explicit what's in a vocabulary. So the idea of a vocabulary, that the definition of a vocabulary as a technical item is a set of declarative sentences, the lexicon, and a set of reason relations, which can just be a set of pairs of premise sets and conclusion sets, implications and incompatibilities, we can code them up. And for these other kinds of metavocabulary, the logical sequent calculus and the sequent calculus for logic and the implication space, you don't need to appeal to anything that isn't in that vocabulary in that sense in order to do your semantics or your semantic-like stuff. Whereas the pragmatic metavocabulary specifies these reason relations by appealing to other stuff, to normative statuses of commitment and entitlement, to practices of defending and challenging. The semantic metavocabulary appeals to other stuff, to states, to fusions, to modal properties of the states in order to explain these things. So there's substantive explanations of reason relations in pragmatic metavocabularies and in semantic metavocabularies. And we're now in a position to see that, well, the first half of it, those substantive explanations. Now, we had to tweak the Truthmaker semantics a bit. You can't do it with the definitions of reason relations that Kit Fine and people have defined. Well, fine, they're happy enough to throw in another one and let's explore what we can do with that. We did sort of build a purpose, the pragmatics. The reason you haven't ever seen an isomorphism result like this, I think, really is that nobody's had a sufficiently developed pragmatic picture that you could demonstrate an isomorphism between it and something else. The semantics has been there. We could have done it with possible worlds or whatever, not this one, but something analogous. But now if we ask, well, what is the Truthmaker story or Kit Fine's story about how you have to use a sentence in order to confer on it these states as truth makers and these states as false makers of it? And you're going to hear crickets. That's not my department. I'm doing metaphysics and semantics, and you're asking a question about how you have to use expressions in order to connect them in the right way with these semantic interpretants. And I don't have anything to say about that. That's for the people doing pragmatics to think about. Broadening the focus a little bit, you should distinguish between the task of formal semantics and the task of philosophical semantics. Formal semantics, you stipulate the association of some semantically relevant whatsits with primitive expressions, and then on that basis systematically derive associations of semantically relevant whatsits of the same general kind with more complex sentences or expressions that are syntactically computable from the ones you started off with. So if you say, well, what establishes the connection between the linguistic expression and its semantic interpretant, you say, I, the all-powerful theorist, do. I stipulate it in what's going to have to be a fairly expressively powerful use language. Philosophical semantics asks precisely the question that formal semantics doesn't. It asks the question, how must you use this expression in order for it to have the content that the semantic content or the semantic interpretant that it's associated with. And Truthmaker semantics does not come with a native pragmatics any more than possible world semantics does, but people like Stalnaker and Lewis worried about what the pragmatics looked like. It's early days for Truthmaker semantics, but we can help them out here. We can say how you have to use expressions in order to be conferring on them. Well, not these truth makers and these false makers, but these consequence relations and incompatibility relations, which you can interpret in terms of your semantics. So we have a connection via the Hlobil isomorphism between norms for using the sentences to make claims and defend and challenge them on the one hand, and the assignment of propositions to them. Those are the ones that stand in the consequence relations that are isomorphic to the consequence relations on the pragmatic side. So, this was a fabulous observation of Wolff's, but it reverberates throughout. We're going to be able to help out the Truthmaker people on the pragmatic side, and it turns out we can help them out a lot on the technical side. Because if you use these definitions of reason relations, you don't need to put a lot of other formal constraints on your metaphysics, and that means you can talk not only usefully about truth value gaps, but also about gluts. It means you can give formal semantics for a whole slew of logics, Angel's logics of conceptual equivalence, for instance, that did not have Truthmaker semantics for them because they were sort of ruled out by the formal conditions that he had to put, as far as he could see, to make the apparatus tractable. I'm not going to talk about many of those additional technical advantages, but Wolff does in chapters 3 and 4 in the book. Okay, now would be a good time for us to take our break, coming back at 2:30, and then I'll talk about conceptual realism and why you get a lot philosophically for having this isomorphism between what you can say in a pragmatic metavocabulary, the right pragmatic metavocabulary, and the right semantic metavocabulary, if you've got them balanced. But the claim is there aren't any other instances of pairs of metavocabulary, pragmatic and semantic metavocabularies, that relate this way. So now we have one. What can we learn from that? I'll address that next. Okay. Well, I want to talk about the historical background that against which I think you should we can begin to appreciate the philosophical significance that we might get from this. And so I want to start way back with one of the biggest things that happened in philosophic history is the sea change from understanding the relation between appearance and reality, or mind and world, in terms of categories of resemblance, to understanding it in terms of categories of representation. And this is something that happened with the advent of early modern philosophy, but we're still in the wake of that gigantic meta-conceptual change. So the original picture, the home language game of the appearance-reality distinction is in perceptual matters, where I look and see a tower on the horizon that looks square, but when we get there I see that it's round. I look at the coin on the table, it looks elliptical, but it's actually circular. On this picture, it's natural to think of veridical perception in terms of a sharing of properties between the way I take things to be and the way things really are. It's a sort of picturing picture that, well, when you had veridical perception of the coin, it looked circular. Your appearance shared the property of circularity with what it was an appearance of. And when you were misled by the elliptical appearance, that was a matter of it's not sharing the perfect circularity. On the other hand, it was veridical in that it was, a closed, even shape and so on. But if you think about the relation between appearance and reality with the perceptual model, it's natural to think that, it's getting the shape right if the shape of the curve that represents Washington's nose on the $1 bill is the same line, the same shape that is congruent with the shape of his actual nose. If we have a color picture of something, it's veridical insofar as it shares colors with the thing it's a picture of. In general, think of us as having the little pictures in our heads, and veridicality is where there are shared properties, and we fall into error where there are where the properties aren't shared between them. And you can think about Platonic forms and Aristotelian forms as very sophisticated developments of such a thought. And that did pretty well. I mean, through the Middle Ages, that was still the way this was thought of, but it was impossible with the new science. On Copernicus's account, the reality is a sun that's standing still and an earth that is moving around it and spinning, where the appearance is the earth standing still and the sun revolving around it. There's no similarity, there's no shared property between being at rest and being moving, between rotating and revolving. The shared properties between appearance and reality, that's not helping us here. And Galileo comes along. The book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, the language of geometry, he means, and shows us that the very best way to understand how things move is to let the length of a line stand for a period of time. Now, what properties do they share? This is such an old metaphor for us, it's hard to recover the strangeness of it, that a temporal span and a spatial span should be laid alongside one another, compared to one another. But he also finds that representing the acceleration of a falling body by the area of a triangle is the best way for us to calculate it. Now, there's really nothing in common between the acceleration of the falling body and the area of the triangle. What is the shared property there? And Descartes comes along with his geometry and says, his algebraic geometry, and says that the best representation of that is, all right, his notation is different, and the best representation of that is x plus y equals 3, let's say. Now, there's really nothing, no shared property in common between them or between them. They're completely different kinds of things. We need a new notion that says why manipulating the one kind of thing is a way of understanding the other kind of thing. And I think it was Spinoza who figured it out. He wrote his first book on the principles of the Cartesian philosophy, and he took much more seriously than Descartes officially did himself the analytic geometry as a model for the relation between appearance and reality, between mind and world. And he says, yeah, those things, the strings of symbols and the geometrical figures have nothing in common. But the reason you can use the one to think about the other is that there's a global isomorphism between the equations and the figures, such that properties that the equations have correspond in relations that the figures can stand into one another, correspond exactly to relations that the equations can stand into one another, so that the fact that the line intersects the square at just two places corresponds to the fact that the equations just have two solutions. And that's what Descartes exploited, where Descartes, insofar as he had a theory of representation, it was that some things were just by nature representations, by nature tanquam rem, as if of things. The world was divided into things that were by nature representings and things that were by nature only to be represented. But Spinoza says the key thing is to understand the relation between appearance and reality is the order and connection of things is the same as the order and connection of ideas. That's the pivotal proposition 7 of the second book of the Ethics. He's saying you've got to understand these relations in the more abstract, more holistic terms, that there are, in fact, shared properties between the equations and the figures, but you can't see them if you just look one by one. If you just look at the circle and its equation, you can't see it. What you've got to see is the way the whole set of equations maps onto the whole set of figures, and so the way relations among figures relate to and is isomorphic to, none of this is language he has, relations among the figures. So it's not even wrong, the model of resemblance wasn't even wrong to think of the relation between appearance and reality, whereby, on the one hand, having these appearances can be, in the veridical case, a way of knowing or understanding the thing the reality, but also can be in error. Thinking about that in terms of shared properties wasn't wrong. What was wrong was thinking of it as sharing local properties or atomistic properties. What's shared is global structural roles. The role the quadratic equation plays in the whole system of other equations is analogous to, structurally analogous to, the role that circles play relative to other figures. So Descartes introduced this more abstract model, representation, that doesn't require, doesn't consist in sharing atomistic properties. But it was really Spinoza who had the holist idea that what was shared was the role these things were playing in their relations to other things on the same side of the barrier. You need to understand properties of this new functional, relational kind. And Leibniz enthusiastically takes over this holistic picture from Spinoza and adds the crucial claim, it's the radical claim, the even more radical claim, that to really understand the relation between appearance and reality, you have to take it that any difference anywhere in what's represented makes a difference everywhere in the representings. That is, if any feature of any monad is different, then every monad, as reflecting it, has corresponding differences. So that any difference anywhere changes something everywhere. That's a further kind of holism beyond what Spinoza already had. But Kant, downstream from Leibniz and Spinoza, he sees that Spinoza's gone fundamentally wrong in his conception of the order and connection of things being the same as the order and connection of ideas, because he doesn't understand, as Kant does, that the order and connection of ideas is fundamentally a normative one, and the order and connection of things isn't. And that's a problem. And the way the problem comes up more specifically for Kant is it leads him to shift the focus of thinking about the relation between appearance and reality on a model of veridical or erroneous perceptions, to thinking about it in terms of conceptual representations. Now, it was one of the bits of expressive power of Descartes' new notion of representation that he could do what it would not have occurred to an Aristotelian to do, namely assimilate sensation, perceptual representations to conceptually articulated ones. Downstream from Descartes, both his rationalist and his empiricist successors applied the same model, thinking of a continuum, a dimension that had perceptual representations at one end and conceptual representations at the other, with intermediate categories between them. They differed in their sort of valorization. For the rationalists, it was these clear and distinct ideas, the conceptual ones, that those were the important ones, and it was as they got confused that you got down to the other end. Whereas the empiricists thought, no, the perceptual ones are completely determinate, and to get to the conceptual, you get more abstract It's painful sometimes to read Hume needing the dimension to more abstraction to do what he can see as he actually does it. He has to do in terms of relations among the things. But the only relation that is what he wants is the notion of the functional role that some experiencing plays with respect to the other experiencings. But he has this single dimension of abstractness to work with, and the only relations he's got, contiguity, resemblance, association, are not rich enough to get for him to build what he needs to build. But Kant thinks that the role that the perceivable and the role that the conceivable play in our epistemic economy is so different that we need to move away from this continuum picture and think of them as playing different roles but collaborating. But he had to face the issue then, what does it mean for reality to show up for us in conceptual form? In the form that can be given as reasons and reasons can be given for. And to do that, he had to break with the tradition, in no small part, precisely on the atomistic versus holistic relational dimension. So the tradition, semantic tradition, logical tradition, it's a little bit anachronistic to call it a semantic insight. I don't know, there's a wonderful classic book that I'd recommend on the semantic tradition from Kant to Frege by Alberto Coffa that is, anyway, I recommend it. The tradition Kant inherited, going back at least to the Port Royal, what the Port Royal logicians made of scholastic logic, was bottom-up and atomistic. It started with the doctrine of concepts that, for instance, distinguished singular and general concepts, concept Socrates and the concept man, and built on top of that a doctrine of judgments in terms of kinds of classification of concepts by concepts. So Socrates is a man, that's one kind of classification, but all men are mortal, that's another kind of classification. So building up by notion of classification from a doctrine of concepts to a doctrine of judgments, depending on how the concepts stand to one another in classificatory relations, and then building on top of that a doctrine of consequences or syllogisms, which are the good inferences depending on the kinds of judgments that were in them. So that's how you classify the syllogism in Barbara, for instance. And Kant started instead of starting with concepts, starts with judgments, really because they're what stand in reason relations, thinks of concepts as functions of judgment, that is, as to be understood just in terms of the contributions they make to judgment. And so that's new. And he was half-hearted about the next step. Sellers said about this crucial move, quote, Kant was on the right track when he insisted that just as concepts are essentially and not accidentally items which can occur in judgments, so judgments, and therefore indirectly concepts, are essentially and not accidentally items which can occur in reasonings or arguments. So saying, no, go all the way up and let's understand these things from the top down. And I'll rush through this bit, but the way I understand this is Kant wanted to understand making a judgment as taking up a kind of normative stance. What was it? Well, it was some kind of commitment, yes, whose entitlement was at risk. But what were you doing? What was judging? What were you doing when you judged? What was taking that responsibility? And he starts with the notion of task responsibility as the simpler, more basic notion, taking responsibility for doing something, for opening the door. No, I'll open the door. Well, what are you taking the responsibility to do in terms of which we could understand taking responsibility that the Cathedral of Learning is 555 feet tall? How do we get from responsibility to do something to responsibility that, or for the truth of a claim? And he says, well, what you're doing in judging is integrating that judgment into a constellation of other judgments, of other commitments. A transcendental unity of apperception. And it's the kind of unity, what you're committing yourself to do is to be able to synthesize this new judgeable into the constellation of commitments you've already got, the one that exhibits this distinctive synthetic unity. And that's a rational unity. So, for instance, in committing yourself to the claim that A, you're committing yourself to resolve any incompatibilities that arise with other commitments that you've got. You're acknowledging that commitment to do something about its incompatibility with any other commitments you acknowledge. You're committing yourself to acknowledge commitment to anything that follows from it. You're committing yourself to give a reason for it if it's challenged or there's some other things that are reasons against it. That's what integrating it into something that has this distinctive kind of synthetic unity consists in. Well, what kind of content does it need to have to do that? Well, it needs to stand in relations of implication and incompatibility that determine what your normative obligations are. This is exactly the place where the bilateral picture of reason relations comes in. It's a matter of positions, constellations of commitments being inbounds or out of bounds. And that's determined by reason relations. We can see all of that as a very Kantian line. So, our judgments have conceptual content in the sense that they play a role in practices of extracting consequences and extruding incompatibles. That's what it is for them to be conceptually contentful. And his claim that this is a transcendental unity of apperception, that it's a unity of apperception, he's saying, doing that, that's what it is to be aware in the sense of apperceiving rather than just perceiving. The conceptually relevant sense is to have it playing a role in the ongoing development of your constellation of commitments to accept and reject. So this is a powerful new conception of the conceptual that he's got. And it's interestingly a non-psychological conception of the conceptual, at least insofar as it's being subject to these norms of reasoning, being articulated by being subject to assessment as to whether you've actually acknowledged all the consequences of your commitment, whether you can give reasons for it, whether you've are appropriately treating it as a reason against other things and so on. But, and it's the transcendental unity of apperception because Transcendental logic is about the relation between representings and representeds, and his project is to understand that relation in terms of this kind of activity. But making sense of conceptual appearances this way precludes you from making sense of what's represented as being in conceptual shape. What's represented is not reasoning. It's not norm governed by norms that say, well, these are incompatible, but you acknowledge nothing like that is going on the side of the represented, except in the special case where we're talking about each other. And that's not trivial, but that's not where we are. That is, Kant's order of explanation commits him to what you could call conceptual phenomenalism, that the conceptual form of our judgments is on the side of the representings, on the side of the subjects. Conceptual form for him is exclusively the product of our rational faculties and our rational activities. What the understanding does with its representings, its judgments, is integrate them into a rational unity. Being manipulated in that way is what having conceptual content is, or having that normative significance that it's appropriate to make some moves and not others, the ones that are licensed by the reason relations. The conceptual can characterize the reality that representings, the conceptual representings that constitute appearings, represent. It can be thought of as conceptual only as represented, not as it is in itself, because the conceptual is literally the product of the activities of the understanding. And that's what, the basis for saying that anything that is an aspect of conceptual form must be transcendentally ideal. It can't be transcendentally real. Once we understand what that conceptual form is, we see why the way things are apart from our activities of representing can't be in conceptual form. Now, I think it's worth noting in this connection, and this is another point I owe to Ryan Simonelli, it's interesting to see how, from this point of view, Kant looks as though he's just turning Plato on his head. Plato's got two realms, an intelligible, we can say conceptual realm, and a perceptible sensuous realm. And the intelligible one is the real one. That's reality that shows up more or less fallibly in perception, in sensation. That's Plato's picture. And Kant's picture is that there's an intelligible, conceptually articulated world. That's the empirical world. But the way things are in themselves, apart from any relation to our rational activities, is not in conceptual shape. So for him, conceptually articulated, that's the real. The conceptually articulated is the appearance, the reality isn't. So it's giving he's sharing something with Plato, but the valences are flipped here. And Sellers follows Kant in this regard. Sellers, like Kant, is a conceptual phenomenalist. Conceptual form is the product of our activities, and so is exclusively characterizes our thinkings, but not what's thought about, except as thought about. Now, Hegel complained about this on behalf of addressing Kant in the very first paragraph of the Phenomenology, introduction, not preface. He complains about this, quote, strict line of demarcation separating knowledge, appearance, from the absolute, reality. For if knowledge is the instrument to take hold of the absolute, of reality, one is immediately reminded that the application of an instrument to a thing, I apply my conceptual reasoning capacities to it, does not leave the thing as it is, but brings about some shaping or alteration of it. If my thinking about it puts what's there into conceptual shape, it's an instrument for turning things that are not in conceptual shape into conceptual shape, so they're knowable, yeah, but it doesn't leave it the same. Or if knowledge isn't an instrument for our activity, but a more or less passive medium through which the light of truth reaches us, then again, we don't receive this truth as it is in itself, but as it is in and through this medium. In both cases, we employ a means which immediately brings about the opposite of its own end. That is, either we needed to change this thing by putting it into conceptual shape in order to grasp it and understand it, or we didn't. If we didn't, this is an unnecessary shuffle. But if we did, then we still don't understand the thing we started with, only this thing that is the product of it. Does understanding appearances as conceptual representings preclude us from taking them to be veridical? Because it necessarily involves giving them a conceptual form that the things we're using them to know don't have. And so is insofar such misleading, just insofar as it's making them intelligible. Now, John McDowell's masterwork, Mind and World, I think can be understood as botanizing various pathologies that result from rejecting conceptual realism, from rejecting, as Kant and Sellers do, the attribution of genuine conceptual structure to how things are before we've come on the scene to think and reason about it. He's exploring the pathologies of taking it that, as he puts it, the realm of the conceptual has an outside boundary, has an outer boundary, which is not in the table, doesn't include the table in it. That boundary marking the cleavage of mind from world in a post-Kantian way, where we understand mind in terms of conceptual representings in the first instance. In order to take the reality we think and talk about as rationally and not merely causally constraining our representings of it, McDowell argues, we have to understand the world that's represented, and not just our representing minds, as always already in conceptual form. And the question is, and it's in this context that he will quote his favorite Wittgensteinian passage, when I say and think that things are thus and so, my thought and my meaning do not stop anywhere short of things being thus and so. Another way of putting this is, you've got to think of it as a world of facts that are conceptually articulated in a way that a world merely of stuff isn't. But the challenge is to say, what in the world do you mean by saying the world is in conceptual shape? And traditionally, there was only one answer to that. It was what Kant called subjective idealism of Berkeley, who says, well, sure, the world that's represented by us is in conceptual shape because it's just the thoughts of the divine world thinker. It's representings. Yeah, I accept that only representings are in conceptual shape, but what's represented by us is the representings of the divine mind. So it's representings all the way down. So I can be a conceptual realist because I say it's representings all the way down, conceptual representing. Or, another way to go that Kant rejects is Leibniz's monadological plenum of represented representers. But again, he says everything is representings. That's all there is to represent. And so it can be conceptual all the way down. So Kant left us with a problem. This distinction of approaches between a conceptual realism that says both sides of the appearance reality or mind and world dichotomy, both sides are in conceptual shape. That's conceptual realism. Or conceptual phenomenalism that says, no, the conceptual, that's a way of talking about our activity, and conceptual shape is what we give to our representings, no doubt by manipulating them in the way we do, by reasoning with them in the way we do. All parties could agree that conceptual shape is role with respect to, well, we want to say reason relations. And reason relations are intimately related to reasoning practices, but we know how to precipitate them out. I'm struck by how good an image of the pickle we're in, conceptual realism, conceptual phenomenalism, how good a picture of that Wallace Stevens' blue guitar poem is. They said, you have a blue guitar. You do not play things as they are. And the man replied, things as they are changed upon the blue guitar. And they said then, but play you must, a tune beyond us, yet ourselves, a tune upon the blue guitar of things exactly as they are. So his blue guitar conceptualizes things. It puts them into intelligible form, and that's fabulous. We want the blue guitar. It's not playing things as they are. It's changing them. He said, well, a blue guitar changes things. That's right. And they said, no, you have to play us a tune on your blue guitar of things exactly as they are. So here's this tension between the conceptual realism we want and the conceptual phenomenalism that post-Kant, that seems to be what we have. But now, we started with a conception of the conceptual as role in reason. You get the phenomenalist conclusion if you say, well, it's only conceptual by playing a particular role in reasoning practices. But we said, Harman taught us to distinguish between reasoning practices and reason relations, and to see the reason relations as normatively governing the reasoning practices, implicit in them to be sure. But, well, it's flatly impossible to see the world as conceptual in a sense that's conferred by reasoning on it. That's basically the Berkeleyan and the Leibnizian alternatives are the only way to do that. Flatly impossible. Well, anyway, unbelievable. I don't know. My colleague Newell Belknap said he had a very rigorous logician's attitude towards things that were unbelievable. He says, I don't believe them. This is, on the whole, a good attitude. But if to be in conceptual form is to stand in reason relations, it could well be that we can understand reason relations of implication and incompatibility in such a way that both commitments to accept and reject what's expressed by sentences can stand in reason relations, and so can Feinean propositions, ways the world could be. That we can get a notion of reason relation that has those two species, as it were, intrinsically, not just we bolt these two together and say we're going to call these versions of one thing called reason relations, but where we can really see one set of relations as showing up in the meta-conceptual perspective of a normative pragmatic metavocabulary on the one hand, and in the alethic modal meta-perspective of a truthmaker semantic metavocabulary. So the aspiration is to use the Hlobil isomorphism to underwrite a conceptual realism that can explain to us what it is for us to understand how things are by making claims about it. Understand intelligibility as knowing our way around these, practically knowing our way around, being able to navigate in reason relations as they show up among the commitments and entitlements that we bandy about and keep score on in our discursive practices. That's how we get a hold of them. But what we're getting a hold of by doing that can be something that holds objectively, independently of us, just because of what the modal facts about what fusions of states are possible and which ones are impossible states. This is not a classical correspondence theory of truth. It's happening at a higher level than that. The correspondence theory of truth is looking for a sharing of properties in a resemblance way, one by one, between the facts and the claimings. The Spinozistic holistic wisdom is you're not going to find that. No matter how long you stare at either of those equations, you're not going to see what connects it to the circle. What you've got to look at is the relations that it stands in to other representings. And then you're going to see how those relations map on so as to connect this equation with this thing. And that's the new model for veridical conceptions of things. But it happens at the level of reason relations, at the level of implications and incompatibilities, not at the level of sentences and claims. This is motivating thinking of vocabularies as a set of sentences, a lexicon, and a relational structure of those sentences that is their reason relations. And I'll just say that can just be a set of pairs of sets of sentences where a pair of sets of sentences gets to be in the vocabulary if it's a good implication from the first one to the second one. And I'll mention this two-edged sword, but we can encode incompatibilities in that form of implication relations. This was Genson's trick, by saying, look at the pairs where the second element is the empty set. And we interpret that as meaning that the set on the left, the premise set, is incoherent. That is, that any element of it is incompatible with all the rest of it. Any subset of it is incompatible with the rest of it, is what we'll mean. Doing that builds in symmetry, one of the reasons people didn't worry enough about that. But anyway, we can encode it that way. So one thing that is, I think, new under the sun is to see the word-world isomorphism that matters for the possibility of knowledge, of thinking about the world, happening at the level of reason relations rather than anything below it. Look, I said this isn't even at the level of facts and claims. A standard way of approaching things would be to start lower than that and say, well, we've got to map the dog Fido onto the word Fido, and the class of dogs onto the word dog, and then we'll build up your correlation between declarative sentences and facts, and derive from that what the good inferences are. And this is saying, no, if you want to understand the sense in which we can grasp the way things are, you've got to start with the reason relations and work your way down. Now, nothing I've said has talked about how to go below the level of sentences, and we actually don't talk about that in the book at all. My intent is to talk about that in weeks 10 and 11 here, because it's not that there's no work on it. I'm just saying there's nothing in the book about it. But for now, thinking about the relation between the reason relations and the sentences and worldly propositions that stand in those reason relations, that's what we should focus on. So that's one feature of this conceptual realism. Second feature of it is it's a bimodal conceptual realism, because reason relations are subjunctively robust. If you think about it from the pragmatic side and ask, what does somebody need to be able to do to count as grasping the concept of a lion? Well, you got to know enough about what moves you can and can't make in the vicinity of lion claims. So you better know things like that. If the lioness is hungry and she sees the nearby wounded gazelle, then she'll probably chase it and kill it and eat it. That's a good implication. Defeasible, but still, you need to know some stuff like that about lions anyway. And to know stuff like that, even though there's a lot of good implications for lions you don't know, there may be you may have bad implications that go with lions. You think, for instance, maybe you think the males do the hunting rather than the females. That doesn't keep you from having the concept, but you got to have enough of it that it's worth us talking lion talk to you. But it's not just enough to know that the implication to this lioness is hungry and she sees the wounded gazelle nearby, so she'll probably chase it down, eat it and kill it and eat it, is a good one. You also need to know that that won't be the case if she's struck by lightning, shot in the head, but that it would be the case if the beetle on the tree 10 miles away crawled faster up the trunk of the tree, that isn't going to make any difference. So you got to have, Sellers says, you're not describing things unless the term you're applying to them, the descriptive term, is situated in a space of implications and incompatibilities, yes. Always don't forget about the incompatibilities. And those incompatibilities, your rough and ready grasp of those comes with a range of subjunctive robustness. That when you say an implication is good, you have some idea what additional premises would infirm it and what would not. So those ranges of subjunctive robustness are built into, of implications and incompatibilities, are built into the Truthmaker framework because we've got a good consequence. Gamma implies A, in that every fusion of a truth maker of all of gamma with a falsity maker of A is an impossible state. Well, okay, and if we throw in a new premise P, is it still the case that all those truth makers of gamma that are also truth makers of P, when they're fusioned with the conclusion, is that also a good implication or not? All that's in the structure of the propositions, the reason relations they stand in, given our definition of consequence. I mean, their relations of entailment and containment consequence, as Fine defines it, those are also completely objective, metaphysical facts. So those implications, those reason relations come with a range of subjunctive robustness. On the objective side, they come with that on the subjective side too, except the modality is different. It's not a matter of what's possible and impossible, but what's normatively inbounds and out of bounds, what constellation of commitments you can be jointly entitled to. The conceptual realism we're pointing the way towards is bimodal, in that on the subjective side that's expressed in the pragmatic metavocabulary, it's a modal vocabulary, but it's a deontic modal, normative vocabulary. That was true already of Restall's original idea. It was a normative pragmatic metavocabulary because inbounds and out of bounds was. He wasn't thinking of position as already a normative matter as we do, but he was definitely using a normative pragmatic metavocabulary. And like the possible world, semantic metavocabulary, the Truthmaker one, appeals to a lethic modality. So we're pointing to a deep connection between what's expressed by normative modal expressions and by lethic modal expressions. And furthermore, saying that that's of the essence of conceptual realism, of the relation of mind to world. Now, if you look for antecedents of that idea, you will find Sellers saying the language of modality is a transposed language of norms. And he says that as part of his metalinguistic analysis of alethic modal terms, where he wants to say all A's are necessarily B's, means it's a good implication from something is an A to something is a B. That's a good rule. And I've suggested that although he pretty much invented the notion of a pragmatic meta-language, that what he really noticed was, what he really had a theory of, is what you're doing when you endorse an alethic modal claim. When I say all A's are necessarily B's, I am endorsing a rule of inference, or anyway, an implication. That's what I'm doing. That's not to say that that's what I'm saying. And what we're seeing here is a connection. What Sellers could never see his way clear to, between what I'm doing, which is taking up a normative stance and endorsing this implication, so committing myself to keep scores so that anybody who is committed to accept all of gamma and to reject A is scored as not entitled to that position. That's what I'm doing when I say all A's are necessarily B's. But what I'm saying is something that the Truthmaker framework lets us understand in terms of alethic modal relations among the truth makers and false makers of A and B. So Sellers saw there was a connection but didn't see what it was in saying the language of modality, alethic modality, is a transposed language of norms. One other case, when I sort of looked for antecedents of this idea, is Paul Grice, who was invited late in his life to give the Locke lectures at Oxford. Traditionally, you're supposed to do your best work and put them into the Locke lectures, as John McDowell certainly did. And Grice had already done everything you know about him for his pragmatics, Gricean pragmatics, but his account of non-natural meaning, and so on. And he postponed giving the lectures twice. And the third time they said, well, no, you have to either give them this year or, we're moving on. And he did, and they were a mess. And they said, well, okay, but it goes with this, that Oxford will publish your lectures. This later came to be known as the McDowell rule, because it had gone without saying until Mind and World, and John wouldn't let Oxford Press do it because they had let Gareth Evans' collected works go out of print, his collected essays go out of print, and that was unforgivable. And his policy towards things that are unforgivable, I probably need to mention. So he took it to Harvard, and everyone was outraged except Harvard University Press. And Oxford put in the McDowell rule. I had to sign a thing, McDowell rule, you have to agree contractually in advance that they can publish your Locke lectures. They never had to do that before. Okay, so Grice, they say, okay, now Oxford were ready for them. He said, well, they're not ready. And they never were ready. When he died, he had not finished these lectures. His devoted students published them posthumously, what he had spoken from in the notes that he had since, as a book called Aspects of Reason, which is a mess because it doesn't have just one theme, but insofar as its biggest theme is that there's really one modal which we can express as ought or should, but it's primordial and more fundamental than the distinction between its deontic and its alethic species. So I can say should, it's 3:30, she should be here by now. That could be normative. Why? Because she promised that she would be here. Or it could be alethic. Well, there's a bit of epistemic in there. She called me when she left her apartment. It's only 10 minutes away. She should be here by now. That's a prediction, or ought to be. He says there's a primordial modality of which its normative and its alethic species are just that, specializations of it, and lots of important things are to be understood linguistically, in linguistics, by this connection, and philosophically in it. And he says some tantalizing things, but he just can't pull it together. But I think had this deep thought, the one that we might now be in a position to make something of. So I said two features to keep in mind. The isomorphism is at the level of reason relations, and that's new. And it is this bimodal conceptual realism, and that's new. And both those things give us tools to work with in doing the next thing, which is thinking about conceptual roles. Well, what claimables are, what's expressed by the use of a declarative sentence that stands in reason relations. As functional roles with respect to reason relations. That is going to give us a notion of rational form that's amphibious between the subjective and the objective realm. A notion of rational form, which is that very same form, what I grasp by being subject to certain norms for making moves in the language game, and that very same rational form which exists objectively in the world, in that these constellations of states, stand in the implication and incompatibility relations that we define. So that notion of rational form, it's a post-Aristotelian. There are many ways in which it's not Aristotelian. Does substantial forms play any role in here? This is all at the level of reason relations and judgeables, claimables. So far, no idea from what we've said, how to drill down farther than that. But that notion of conceptual content that's shareable between mind and world, that's what we're going to work with in this conceptual realism. Okay, so I said that was a punchline. You need to do a lot of work to get here, but we'll figure this out. And it will turn out that when we get to the logic, that it makes a lot of things possible in the logic that aren't possible otherwise. Next time, still a punchline. Probably don't have the killer app that I think of this isomorphism as being in that case. We have a lot of interesting, tantalizing stuff to say. Next week, the theme is, well, okay, what's the structure of reason relations? What can we figure out about it, and how can you make that explicit? And you have to do it very differently than the tradition did, but in a way that lets us say everything the tradition could say. So there's some nice results there, maybe nothing quite as pretty as I think the global isomorphism is. So if you didn't read anything in advance, but were interested, which you're always sort of allowed to, I'm here to tell the story, and I'm going to tell it as though you had infinite ignorance and infinite intelligence, as Weil said. But so, if you didn't read anything but are curious about this, the essay called "A Tune Beyond Us Yet Ourselves" is probably the easiest way to get into it. If you're more interested, chapter 4 of the book lays this out. I'll be talking about material from chapter 2 next time. So this is meant to have whetted our appetites for thinking harder about reason relations. If they're going to be what connects us to the world, other than causes. It's a higher level. Okay, very fine.